Welcome to this episode of Flourishing Leadership. I'm your host, Guy Rogers, and our mission here is to help you unleash the full potential of your leadership calling. You can find out more about flourishing leadership at flourishing-leadership.com. My guest today is Major General Bob Stevenson, retired. Major General Stevenson retired from the United States Air Force in 2022 after a 34-year career of service on active duty and in the Air National Guard. He was a command pilot with over 5,000 flying hours in trainer, tactical airlift, refueling, and strategic reconnaissance aircraft. He commanded at the squadron, group, and wing levels. He completed the last 5 years of his career at United States Strategic Command, serving as Deputy Director of Operations, J3, and Director Joint Electromagnetic Spectrum Operations. And then finally as the Guard and Reserve Affairs Advisor to the Commander of U.S. STRATCOM. He was also an Airborne Emergency Actions Flag Officer aboard the E-6B Looking Glass Airborne Command Post. As a student of military history and leadership, he was a longtime presenter at a leadership training forum developing mid-level leaders within the Nebraska Air Guard, specializing in presentations on developing strategic thinking and the nuances of negotiations. He holds a BA from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, my alma mater, by the way, and an MBA from Bellevue University. He resides in Lincoln, Nebraska, with his wife of 40 years, Sherry, and is the father of 4 and grandfather of 7. And Bob, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us on today's podcast.
My pleasure, Guy.
We've known each other for many years, and I've had the opportunity to watch your career path unfold. Like so many of us, it's had its share of twists and turns. So to begin with, tell us a little bit about your story and what you most learned about leadership development.
Well, I'll go back to college. I met my wife in college. We got married young and kids started right away. Early in my 20s, I really didn't even know what my plan was or what I wanted to do with my life. And I really hadn't considered the military. But she and I were working in youth care, actually at Father Flanagan's Boys Home in Boys Town, which is a leadership laboratory of its own kind, I will tell you. But I was flying for fun. I had my private pilot's license, and it was a stress release actually for me. And then, Top Gun came out, and that was interesting to me. And I thought, wow, I wonder if I could even go back and do this. I thought that ship had sailed. And I put in applications to the Navy and the Air Force. The Air Force took me, and I went off to officer training school and became a second lieutenant, and then headed off to pilot training, where I did fairly well enough that they kept me there. And I was an instructor pilot teaching new pilots how to fly for about 4 years. And this was right after Gulf War I, when George Herbert Walker Bush had made the deal with Congress, and they cut the military and slashed cockpits and airplanes and all kinds of things. And no new taxes became new taxes, and a lot of other stuff happened. But the politics drifted down and hit my career. And finally, I wanted to get out of there, and I asked for any fixed-wing aircraft overseas, and they gave me a C-130 to Japan. And 4 days before we left for Japan, they changed the orders and sent me to South Georgia. And that ended up actually being fortuitous. I really enjoyed that mission. It was a composite wing, which was an Air Force experiment at the time. We had 3 squadrons of F-16s, a squadron of A-10s, and then C-130s. But we got to fly with each other all the time, and it was a lot of fun. And I got invited by United Airlines in 1997 to come interview. So I thought I would get out. Just fortuitously at the time, I got hired by the Louisville, Kentucky Air National Guard. And the very next day, the Nebraska Air National Guard put out an ad for tanker pilots flying KC-135 aircraft, of which I had no experience whatsoever, but made a phone call and thought maybe it would be fun to come back home to Nebraska. I did that. And I got hired, and I came home, and my intent at that time was to finish out 20 years of part-time service and get an airline job and retire in Nebraska and from the military after 20 and lieutenant colonel and call it good. I ended up getting the airline job, but not with United, with a different company called Midwest Express, which again was also a fascinating first-class service front to back. Every seat was a first-class seat. And it was a blast. I was having a wonderful time until 9/11/2001.
Right.
And the airline industry was hit very hard.
Yeah.
And on top of that, my unit was going to war. And so I volunteered to deploy for a year overseas. stepped up and took my place. And I, again, we're talking about leadership here, and I felt like that was leadership from a standpoint that my kids had heard me talk about leadership and heard me talk about sacrifice and putting, service above self and other concepts. And I thought that I have to now, fish or cut bait, and it's time to fish. And so I stepped up and deployed, and we went overseas, and I was basically overseas only through the end of the Afghanistan campaign. And then we started rotating, and I came home. We were still unsure of the skies over the United States were protected, and an operation called Operation Noble Eagle. So I stayed on active duty with my guard unit, flying tankers over the United States and supporting fighter aircraft, protecting major cities and important sites, and did that for about a year. And then my guard unit said, hey, we've got a full-time slot here. Would you like to stay for a while? And my intent then was to stay for about 3 more years and then go back to the airlines and after things settled down, because the economy was still in turmoil. The war was still progressing in Iraq and one thing and another.
Yep.
Well, they just kept giving me leadership roles, first as a flight commander, and then eventually as the director of operations for the squadron, and then squadron commander. And then I got sent to Offutt Air Force Base to command a strategic reconnaissance group there, and came back from that and took the Air National Guard wing here in Lincoln, which is again is a tanker wing. And when I completed that tour, I got promoted to brigadier general. And I was the assistant adjutant general on the air side here in Nebraska for about 6.5 months. And then I was invited to go to US Stratcom because they needed a deputy director of operations, and they needed a director of their joint electromagnetic spectrum ops, which is too much to get into as far as this podcast goes, but it's a big thing, and it goes across the entire Department of Defense, if not the department span of government in reality. And so I finished out my last 5 years as a general officer at Stratcom. And part of that deal was to be a battle deck certified leader, to be able to step up and employ the nuclear forces of the United States of America at the President of the United States direction. And so we maintain multiple command posts across the United States, Stratcom being first in line. And then there are backups all the way from Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado to and in Washington, D.C., at the Pentagon, et cetera. But attrition in a nuclear war is fairly rapid. And so our last resort is to have a flag officer on board an aircraft that's airborne and that can communicate with the president wherever he is, be it Air Force One or a secure location or wherever. And again, as U.S. law states, only the president of the United States can employ nuclear weapons, but it is required that a flag officer be the person who briefs the president on the war plan and what his options are. And so I did that job. It was fascinating. It was incredible. I worked with some incredibly brilliant and incredibly talented leaders in those roles, humbling even to be even invited in that room. But fundamentally, what I would tell you over the span of 34 years of my military career is that I joined the Air Force to fly airplanes. I really wasn't in it to lead. It wasn't probably until I was about 10 years in that I actually realized that leading people and making things happen and solving problems and developing people and helping them become leaders was also a talent that I had acquired. It was a long road. It was a very rewarding career, and it did have twists and turns. I mean, who saw 9/11 coming?
Right.
And I had no intention of going back to active duty, and no intention of ever flying an RC-135 or the OC-135 at Offutt or being on the looking glass. None of that was, and all of those things again came back around and became opportunities for me, and I happened to be properly equipped and ready to accept those challenges.
Yeah, your life is such a perfect example of the never say never when you're looking as to where you may be going in your path. I've had that in my life. Things have happened that I would have gone, I never would do something like that. And then an opportunity presents itself 5 years down the road, and you go, maybe I need to take a look at this. And that is really part of not only personal growth, career growth, but leadership growth. if we're willing to step out, and there are certain risks involved in some of these things. You experienced them. I remember when you were flying for that airline, and then what happened after 9/11. I remember very clearly how those twists and turns happened. And so thinking then about what you just said about leadership, there's a gazillion different definitions of leadership. I mean, you look up leadership and everybody's got them. So in a nutshell, then, from what you've learned, how you've applied this, what would you say to our listeners qualifies as a good definition of leadership?
Well, that's interesting because you're exactly right. You can Google or go to Amazon and find thousands of books on leadership. And the fact is that we have these discussions all the time because it's fascinating to us to watch people who lead organizations and who inspire followers to follow them. How do I define leadership? Stephen Covey says that any failures, sometimes it's fun to look at what isn't leadership and compare it and contrast it. Stephen Covey says, most failures in leadership come down to competence or character. So competence is to me is like the first thing. You have to have some degree of technical competence. And yet I would tell you from my own story that when I got sent to Offutt to be a group commander the first time, I did not have any experience whatsoever in the RC-135. I was leading a whole bunch of people who've been doing this mission and were experts at it. And I was put in place because of failures of competence and failures of character to fix some problems. And that was a great learning experience, one of the best assignments that I ever had. But I walked in and told them, I was just straight up with it, said, guys, I don't know what you do, but here's what we're going to do. And we're going to be honest with each other. We're going to be transparent. So number one, I told them that I wasn't competent. Number two, I told them that we're going to have relationships and there's not going to be any secrets and we're not going to talk with filters and there aren't any no talk rules. But initially I had to step into a role as a positional leader. And, I was the commander and they all understood that. But after that, I had to find out who my informal leaders were by developing relationships with them. So relationships are incredibly important to get people to buy in. Yep. You have to provide them with a vision. You got to give them boundaries to say, hey, we're going to do this, that, but we're not going to go outside of this realm or that realm. There's only about 5 big things that we really need to avoid. One is hurting somebody or killing somebody. Number 2 is bending metal. Number 3 was spending a lot of money. And I get the question a lot was, what's a lot of money? Well, a lot of money is like 5% of your discretionary or 30% of your margin. Okay. That's a lot of money. Less than that, don't worry about it. It's not worth getting excited about, but learn from it. Do not break the law. And what's the last one? Don't embarrass the organization. And I had those as my 5 big things, but I have had, and my lovely wife provided me a plaque that when I got my first command of the scripture, Micah 6:9, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. And that was hung in every office that I've ever worked because it sent a message to the people that work for me that, look, I'm just the guy in charge right now, but I have the say. I mean, I own it. I will own our decisions. My failures and our successes are your successes, and that is how we're going to go forward. And then you got to have energy. The last thing is energy. So integrity, technical competence, and build relationships. And you got to have energy. You got to be there in the morning when they get there, and you pretty much have to be there sitting at the desk when they start to leave. They got to know that you're there for them and you're working as hard as they're working. Because if you're the guy who shows up an hour after everyone else is at work and bugs out for a 2-hour lunch, and they know you're not invested. Right. And so my definition of leadership is a kind of a conglomeration of all those things. It's maybe just concise or clear, but it's the things that I have used as guidance on how to lead people, how to want to get them to follow you. Right. And it has worked for me.
Right. Well, especially important what you talked about in terms of relationships and buy-in.
Yeah.
I remember an organization that I was leading for a little over 6 years, and I had a small staff. It was like 10 people. And I remember one of our $100,000 donors asked me the question, how much staff do you have? Because we were doing an annual report, what we were doing and so on. I told him, I said, 8 full-time, 2 part-time. And he looked at me and he said, how are you doing that with such a small staff? And I said, it's the chemistry of the staff. It's the chemistry of this team. it really was an example of the total is greater than the sum of the parts and how you can create that kind of synergy. That's what you're talking about. And I have found that there are people who have potential to be great leaders, but they aren't adept at bringing out the leadership in others.
Oh,
and so
absolutely.
they create a low ceiling. They create a low ceiling for what they're trying to accomplish because they don't empower others to rise to their fullest. That's the motto of what I do as a leadership coach, is helping people realize the full potential of their leadership calling. And that's what you're talking about.
Well, it may be kind of depressing for you to hear this, but I've used this line actually even in change of command speeches that I was either participating in or accepting the command or giving up the command. But in 34 years of service, I worked with and worked for and had commanders who worked for me. About 50% of them were not very good at all.
Yeah.
Not very good at all. Either guys that I worked for or guys or gals that worked for me were not very good. And that may seem kind of sad. When you achieve the rank of colonel in the military or captain in the Navy, 06, only 5% of officers commissioned ever achieve that rank. It's not the top 5%. It's just 5%. Because some of those guys are toxic leaders. You know, a 2-star that I used to work for one time was in a meeting of 4-star generals. There were 27 4-star generals in this closed, it's called a Corona conference, 27 4-star generals. Obviously talented, obviously intelligent, obviously great leaders, great men. But in reality, he would point out that 22 of them went to the same university in Colorado at the academy. And what diversity of thought and understanding is there. So, yeah, sometimes you might have to learn how to be a good leader by working for a bad leader. That happened to me for sure. And I was not perfect. I made mistakes. And one of the things that I would, encourage listeners is you got to it's very hard as a leader to get people to tell you the truth. Because, you say, if you walk around and you do leadership by walking around and you get to know people and you ask them questions, how you doing? I'm fine.
Yeah, right.
Really? Are you really fine?
Are you really fine? Right.
And they do. They try to protect you. They'll go, boss, you don't want to hear that. You don't need to know about my problem. One of the benefits, and again, I'm watching time, but one of the benefits of my time in South Georgia was I worked for a colonel of 06 at that time. His name was Mark Welsh. He later became the chief of staff of the Air Force. Great 4-star general. The guy, I would follow him anywhere. He could call me now and I would settle up. But he tells a story of how he was the commander of the Wolf Pack, which is an F-16 wing in South Korea. Everyone there has no family with them. They're all deployed for a year to run that wing and keep North Korea at bay and scared. And he would drive around the base and talk to different people. And there was a specific crew chief that he sometimes ran into and spoke to and got to know. And one night, this first sergeant comes in on a Friday afternoon and says, boss, we got to get this guy home to the United States. His ex-wife is a drug addict and his daughter's about to be put into foster care. And he has to get the foster care hearing on Monday morning. And we got to get this done and we got to get him moved. And they made a bunch of phone calls late on a Friday and they got this guy on an airplane and they got him home and they got his assignment to the Wolf Pack terminated, got him a new assignment where his daughter lived and he was able to take custody. And you say, well, that's a great example of leadership that General Mark Welsh employed. And yet, you talk to Mark Welsh about it, he'll say, how come I didn't know about his daughter?
Oh, yeah.
Until the crisis happened.
Until the crisis.
Why did it take the crisis for me to find out about his daughter? I should have known about her and asked him, again, always gives me goosebumps when I think about that story because it was an example of you've got to get to know your people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you command a wing, you have 4 or 5 06s who work for you. They're your rank, but they're not the commander. They're command a group below you. So you don't lead the wing. You lead the leaders who lead the wing. Right. And becoming a leader of leaders is about developing them, but developing trust. And if you surround yourself with good ones, if you have that ability and that choice, you can't help but be successful. If they are competing with each other, it's a mess. If they are collaborative, it's awesome.
Yeah, and I saw so much of that in the political world, the climbing over each other's backs to climb up the ladder. It is so toxic, so much of it. And what you said about what you can learn from leaders who aren't good leaders is absolutely true. Listeners, you may be in a situation where you're in that, where you're working for someone or with someone, and they're just not a good leader. Look at what you can learn from that. I remember one man that I worked under, and I learned so much about how I didn't want to be a leader later in life from watching how he did. And that can be as valuable as working for someone who is a really good leader. So it's a really good point. So I want to close this with I think a very important question, because, and I was intrigued by this when you and I were corresponding prior to the interview, that you've taught that an effective leader must be able to adjust his or her leadership style to prevailing circumstances. What are those leadership styles, and how does one learn to adapt to them and use them strategically?
Well, this comes back down to the idea that, if you're a leader, you typically have some qualities of a type A personality. And in a crisis, you have to be directive to gain control of the crisis. And in the military, we learn very quickly that sometimes that's what's necessary, is you give orders and people go execute those orders. But in day-to-day operations, if you're operating that way, you're not getting the most out of your people.
Right.
And that's an element of it. The danger there is that if taken to the extreme or used all the time, you are a micromanager.
And I've seen that crisis management, all the time. Everything's an urgency. Everything's urgent. Yep.
And I would tell you that as an officer, we had non-commissioned officers, enlisted guys who worked for us, and sometimes they would not make decisions. And the reason that they wouldn't make decisions, some officer at some point taught them not to. Taught them, do not make a decision, come to me and ask me what to do. Well, that's not how we want to lead. I need you to make decisions at your level within the boundaries that I set, and I will back you up. But they have to trust you that that's the case. And they will only do that if you develop a relationship. So you asked me, what are the leadership styles? Well, certainly directive leadership, crisis leadership is an important skill to have for those times when it's necessary, but It should not be constant go-to. On the other side of that coin is collaborative leadership, where, hey, I don't want to make, I've worked for guys like this. They don't want to make a decision until they know that everyone else agrees with the decision that we're going to make, and that kind of take a vote, and it's a democracy. And if we can't come to a consensus, then I'm not going to decide at all, and I'll put this decision off and until it's either pushes into a crisis. I mean, it's just annoying. It annoys the people. Like, just decide. It's pretty clear what we ought to do. So collaborative leadership is, hey, what's your input? What do you think? How does this affect you guys? And then working amongst those in the day-to-day, I think that's where we want to go. But at the same time, then you set your goals and your visions. What do we want to accomplish? And what are the problems that we need to solve to get to there? A lot of times we set those obstacles up in front of us when we set a goal, and then we wait until it's crisis time. And then I get directive, and then we knock the obstacle down, and then we go forward. And that is not the kind of leadership that people want to work.
Right.
I mean, they don't want to work for that.
Right.
So I would just state that, you have to look at your demographics. What are the skill sets of the people that you're working for, who are working for you? Are they capable? And if they're not, what do you do to get them there? You look at the timeline that you have available to you. The more time you have, the more options that you have. From there, let them make mistakes, because they learn from that, but it also builds trust. If they make a mistake, it costs the company money, costs the organization money, but you go, hey, we learned from that. I probably would have done the same thing you did. We'll pay that bill. We'll learn from it. Let's not do that again. And then we go on from there. It's built trust.
Right.
You bought trust with that money.
Right.
So I was very much a collaborative type of leader day to day, but my folks trusted me that if we were in a exercise scenario where there was a simulated crisis, that if I gave direction, they would execute because they trusted me and I trusted them. And that is the best environment that you can develop. If you have somebody that you can't trust because they either have an integrity issue or their competence level is not there, then it's a coaching issue, and you step in and help them. Right. Skills. And so it's very dynamic. It's a very, very dynamic environment. And I would be very open and talk to folks about how we're going to do it. But you got to walk the same thing that you talk. If you don't do that, you're just tearing down, again, the trust and the success of the organization. And everybody in the organization that works for you needs to feel like you want them to succeed and that you want them to come forward and move forward. And if they feel that, they'll follow you.
Yeah.
And be very helpful.
Very, yeah, very true. And I like how you pointed out the two sides of the coin, the actual extremes, the directive and the collaborative. The collaborative can be so intent on consensus building that it's the governing by committee, and that does not work. And I've seen it, and they won't follow that. But you can create the same type of problem for a different reason if it's always directed crisis management. I remember it's one particular individual that I worked for was constantly putting things in front of me. Everything was an urgency. And my plate was full. And so I tried to figure out how I was going to deal with that. So one day I just said to him, so which of these other urgent things do you want me to take off my plate so I can do this urgent thing?
Yeah.
And I actually helped to move him in a direction where I made him make a choice of what he wanted me to focus on, because there were too many things. I got to a point where anybody can reach a point of full up. And I was at a place of full up, and there was just no more capacity. And I tried to figure out how to deal with this. That actually worked pretty well. And I actually had opportunities to work with others who are in a similar situation and say, try this and see what happens. And so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But hey, Bob, this has been really good. Thank you so much for taking the time. Your life has indeed taken a lot of twists and turns. I remember you being in South Georgia. I remember us rooting for a particular football team in the national championship game. You remember that?
Yeah.
The Huskers when they beat Florida. Yeah. I remember that very clearly. So it's been good. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Just congratulations on a really great career. Well done.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
As a certified professional leadership coach, I have the privilege of working with leaders of all ages and backgrounds, C-level executives, nonprofit leaders, small business owners, and self-employed professionals. I am passionately driven to help each of these men and women be better servant leaders every day. In this podcast, my goal is to help you do the same. That's my calling, and that's my mission. If this message today speaks to you, please subscribe to this podcast by searching Flourishing Leadership with Guy Rogers on your favorite podcast app, or you can find it on youtube.com/flourishing leadership. And please let your friends and colleagues know about it, and check us out at flourishing-leadership.com, where you can learn more about my leadership coaching approach and methodology and how it can help you. And where you can also find all of the podcast episodes, because today, your leadership, flourishing leadership, has never been more needed.